From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. I'm Judith Gray. I'm the coordinator of reference for the American Folklife Center here at the Library of Congress. And I'd like to welcome you to the latest presentation in our ongoing series, the Benjamin A. Botkin Folklife Lecture Series, which has been going on since 2003. This series allows us to highlight the work of leading scholars in the disciplines of folklore, ethnomusicology, oral history, cultural anthropology, and cultural heritage, while specifically enhancing the collections here at the American Folklife Center. For the center and the library, the Botkin lectures form an important facet of our current acquisitions. Each lecture is videotaped and becomes part of the permanent collections of the center. In addition, the lectures are later posted as webcasts on the library's website, where they're available for viewing to internet patrons throughout the world. That being said, let me remind you at this point, it would be a good idea to turn off cell phones and things that might buzz or do other interesting things to be captured permanently on the record. So today I have the honor and the distinct pleasure of introducing the distinguished ethnomusicologist, Dr. Mark Slobin, who's the Winslow Kaplan Professor of Music and American Studies at Wesleyan University. In the course of his career, Dr. Slobin has written extensively on a variety of subjects, including Eastern European Jewish and klezmer music, global soundtracks and musical subcultures, ethnomusicological practice and theory, and the music of Afghanistan, where he conducted research beginning in 1967. He has served as the president of the Society for Ethnomusicology and the Society for Asian Music, and as editor of the journal Asian Music. He's been the recipient of numerous prizes, including the Seeger Prize from the Society for Ethnomusicology, 2 ASCAP Deems Taylor Awards for his books, the Jewish Cultural Achievement Award for Lifetime Achievement from the Foundation for Jewish Culture, and the Kurt Leviand Award in Yiddish Studies from the Modern Languages Association. And in his spare time, during his 45 years as a university professor at Wesleyan, he has also trained a significant proportion of today's ethnomusicologists, and I have to say that includes me. I can only wish all current graduate students a mentor as supportive and as engaged as Mark. Thank you very much. So next month, Mark will be retiring from Wesleyan, where he was recently honored with a day-long conference celebrating his career and many accomplishments. And despite retiring from full-time teaching, though, he shows no signs of slowing down. And so looking ahead, we hope to see more of him here in D.C. He says he hasn't been invited of late. He is now, and especially to the Library of Congress. Today, however, he's going to be looking backwards to discuss some of his earliest musical experiences. And after the lecture, he'll be available for a book signing, Folk Music, a Very Short Introduction, which will be available for sale and for his signature right after. So for the moment, please join me in welcoming Mark Slobin for his talk on Improvising a Musical Metropolis, Detroit from the 1940s to the 1960s.
Thanks, it's great to be here and in these hallowed halls. And as you've heard, I've worked on many things over a very long career. And for some reason, because Detroit was so much in the news, I kept explaining it to people. And I said, well, nobody understands this place. And I grew up there. And what would it be like to study it a little bit and see what the music culture was really like in the city in my day? So this is a curious project because it's partly a memoir, but it's not a memoir. It's also a study of the city. The life of a city. There is no book that is the life of an American city's music in any period of time. We just don't do that. So it's an interesting project. So I'm going to give you a certain update on what I'm up to, and I'm writing the book now. that this will be based on. What you find out when you work in so many projects is that your mind always goes the same direction. So I've always been interested in small musical systems that are embedded within a larger system of many kinds of things going on and some overarching musical structure in a society, what I've called micromusics. So I began to realize, looking at Detroit, it was really kind of a micromusic study, so I'm going to be explaining that. And cities are extremely complicated. One of the great thinkers on cities, Henri Lefebvre, French theorist, says that the city unveils a number of systems hidden in the illusion of oneness. And the city manifests itself as a group of groups, which is a situation of plurality, coexistence, and simultaneity. These are what I have found in the music. So there's a very complex system of interactive parts in this great city. So the talk is in 4 parts. First, I'll frame Detroit as a city in my day and myself as an actor, as a person there. Then I'll talk about this mainstream micromusical interactivity within the city. I've used the word superculture in my writings for this overarching structure that one has, and then subcultures. Then I'll look at some of the micromusical systems themselves, including my own community, the Jewish community. And then I'll talk about some directions for understanding urban musical spatiality. Okay? So first, what is Detroit? What was it then? Detroit grew later and more explosively than other northern industrial cities like Chicago and Cleveland. It outgrew its modest status as a kind of waterways, crossroads, and site of small manufacturing, ovens, typewriters, only after 1910. Doubled in size by 1920, doubled again by 1930. So it's a very late, very explosive growth. And it owes it simply to one factor, the success of Henry Ford and his rivals in attracting a huge proletarian workforce to create a mass market for the automobile. Detroit has been called the capital of the 20th century because of the way it defined modern production and modern industrial life. And somebody says it was in a state of continuous flux, with as few stagnant moments and interruptions as possible. So this is a very dynamic system I'm looking at, not some kind of frozen industrial city. Both the corporate systems and the governmental systems, part of this superculture, had to improvise, that's my title, continuously and drastically by the conditions that they created. The invention of the automobile and people using it itself changed the conditions of life. The scale of building was unprecedented, actually, and eventually we get the first urban freeway and the first shopping center in America. And by the 1950s, the twin logics of capitalism and racism, combined with arrogance and short-sightedness, destroyed Detroit's economic base, making it the only American city to both rise above and fall below 1 million inhabitants. Okay. The demographic key to the city was the accelerated arrival of 3 supergroups. Internally, they were very diverse, but musically, they looked kind of cohesive. First, the European immigrants, such as my relatives, until the cutoff of mass immigration in 1924. Second, the largest were 350,000 Polish Americans in this city that got up to about 2 million. Second, African Americans from the South, who appeared later and more intensively to Detroit than other cities as part of the Great Migration. And third, white Southerners, who streamed in by the hundreds of thousands, particularly during the war years when the population explodes yet again. These subcultures, were also improvising, finding ways to survive the rigors of the workplace, manage their communities, create an expressive culture, especially including music, and get along with other immigrants. Detroit was a pressure cooker, and the heat was turned on too high. It exploded in the Great Wartime Race Riot of 1943, just after I was born. This was the only American city to be occupied by the U.S. Army 3 times. I was just 3 months old, and spent the day. Maybe could we? Can you think the front lights go down? It would be interesting to see if the front lights go down. There I am, just before the riot. And we were in Belle Isle, this beautiful island park of Belle Isle. How did I get to be there? My father was born in Detroit, and his mother was born in New York in 1890. So on that side, I'm 3rd generation American born, but everybody else came from southern Ukraine. a few family photos will show the pathway to America and the kind of assimilation and how I became kind of a mixed subcultural and mainstream person. So I'll just run through a few photos here. This is my father's parents having their honeymoon. If you're immigrants in 1910, you go to Niagara Falls for honeymoon, even if it looks like that. And you see the industrial smoke from the Nabisco factory and what it means to be an immigrant. She's only 19 there. She looks a great deal older. And here is the my mother's side. That's my mother, the little girl in Ukraine, at the same time, right in the same, just a couple years later. And she got to America. And then my parents' honeymoon is, of course, they're Americans now, and they go see New York and go to the Statue of Liberty. Okay. And then there's my growing up as an American / subcultural person. So what does this mean? It means cowboys and Indians. Okay, so here I'm wearing my cowboy thing, and there's my little friend David Drothler with his headdress. Okay, this is what it means to be American. Okay, is to be bouncing off subcultural issues. Here I am. It's a mainstream person. Okay. This is, and my mother is just great. She wrote Superman, 1946. So I know exactly what these things are. So here, so that's also mainstream. Okay, popular culture is mainstream. And then we went to Mexico. So then I get to be a gringo and an American tourist. Okay, all coming out of this immigrant kind of roots. But this is what American means. It's a set of stereotypes and activities that relate to popular culture and so forth. Okay. Okay. So, all right, we'll go back here. Right. So I left the Detroit area from nearby Ann Arbor, where I got my doctorate. After I was in I went off to do Afghanistan. It was just at the same time as another riot. So I'm kind of framed by these rebellions or uprisings or whatever they're called in 1943 and 1967. Detroit has barely survived the aftershocks and the decline of these various explosions, trying literally, actually, to crawl out of the rubble, even as the unconcerned suburbs thrive very well in the area. It's very hard for me to map my city onto what I see today, but that's another story. Okay, so we'll get to part 2 now, the life of music in this molten metropolis, and here I'm concentrating on what I've called the superculture, which in this case is the educational system, music education. Detroit's combination of dynamic growth and tense social negotiation was nowhere more apparent than in the design space. And Lefebvre talks about design space and lived space. The public schools are part of design space. High school music showcases the stability and the turbulence of a rapidly changing city. I'm going to single out 2 schools. One is Miller High, where my father taught. He was a school teacher in 1937. And Cass Tech, my alma mater, and that of countless important musicians from Ron Carter and Diana Ross through Jerry Allen and Jack White. All these people went to Cass Tech. Okay. Its music program was extraordinary. So the overlap and the distinctions between Miller High and Cass Tech give me a really nice platform for talking about a lot of the musical issues, and I have some firsthand experience as well. So actually, you can look at American Literature on Public School Music. In 1941, the WPA Guide to Michigan said, pioneer work in public school music has been important to the entire nation. And then in 1940, a book called High School Music presents Cass Tech's curriculum and a survey of renowned programs in America. And here's the ideology. Nothing is more significant of the increasing socialization of education than the rapid extension of instrumental study in connection with schools. Playing upon an instrument is not merely a personal accomplishment with individual benefits, but is a social power which affects many persons in addition to the performer. So there's very strong ideology about the importance of instrumental music. At Miller High, this attractive version of Americanization through music was largely foreclosed by the Board of Education. Miller had been a junior high, was changed to senior in 1933 to accommodate the huge influx of African American students. The white parents were notified they could move their children out of the district, so the school quickly became all black. This impacted the music. There's a wonderful interview I found in a dissertation with a music teacher who would have been a colleague of my father's, Ms. Dolman. In 1940, she says, the board removed all the classical instruments from Miller, sending them to other schools whose students' background and breeding would lend them better to cultured classical music. So if you wonder why Milt Jackson played the vibes instead of the cello, he went to Miller. There's some really precise things here. Things didn't work out that way due to the dedication of the teachers who struggled and succeeded in supporting all these amazing kids who were coming through Miller. High school music says the aim of instrumental study in schools is principally cultural and social and only incidentally and remotely vocational. Okay? But Ms. Dolman says something else. She says, music classes were business classes for our kids. They practiced long and hard to develop their skills, and that's why Kenneth Burrell and William Evans, later Yusuf Lateef, Milton Jackson, and several others are recognized as being the best at their instruments. I can't help mentioning my father actually taught American history to Kenny Burrell and probably many other future jazz greats when he was at Miller. Milt Jackson, in his dissertation, notes that had he not dropped out of high school, he probably would have gotten a college music scholarship like a lot of his classmates did. Dolman's eyewitness account is in this remarkable 1970 dissertation by Cloizelle Jones, and they oppose the establishment. High school music, again, says, America does not have that racial solidarity which favors the development of peculiar musical idioms. While we have discovered interesting folk music among the Indians and Negroes, and make use of it and enjoy it, yet it cannot be said that this is typical of the American people at any period. Now, Ms. Dolman's response to this erasure of subcultural tradition was to help build a model for success in establishment music. She tells us that the African-American students couldn't get buses to go to the competitions, but they went anyway, and they would win the All-City Band Contest. They could read and play all types of music, even the Mozart that the big shots downtown felt was not akin to their heritage, she says. Dolman... Oh, wait, I have a picture of this, which I'm not showing you. Okay, so here's Miller High, and up in fine arts, fine arts, we have, get this, Ms. Dolman here. And then under social studies, we have my father here, okay. So, and his friends, these are all people who came over to our house all the time. The huge mass of Jewish school teachers in Detroit. Dolman also made use of black resources right in the building. She brought in a janitor to help train her chorus, and I presume this is somebody who probably had church gospel singing background or was helpful with her training choruses. I cite her because we have her testimony. She's not famous like the great Louis Cabrera, who Yusuf Lateef and Kenny Burrell cite as really important in their musical formation, who was also teaching at Cass Tech, and I'll bring Cabrera back later. The supportive music system Miller High, which only lasts till 1957, offers a striking complement to the general urban trajectory of Detroit, marked by black neighborhood destruction for freeways to the newly built suburbs, relocation to housing projects, and a combination of heavy-handed policing and economic neglect. So music shows us that these supercultural systems, however, are not hegemonic wholes, but they're partial systems with cracks that offer alternatives. We should not forget the musical families like the McKinneys of Detroit and the Joneses, and we're talking Thad Jones, Elvin Jones, that family, that nurtured talent outside of school. The pianist Barry Harris, who was himself, to this day, in his late 80s, an influential teacher, as a teenager, taught all the other kids stuff. And I asked him, I said, what about what you learned at school and what you learned? And he said, outside, he said, at school, we just learned stock arrangements. But as street musicians, he says, they picked up the skills in the neighborhood and among these families. So you have a very complicated kind of supercultural, subcultural relationship going on. Cass Tech offers a different model of patronage. It was the magnet school for the entire city of Detroit. There was one gigantic magnet school. It was 8 stories high, occupied a huge downtown space. And it wanted to let kids advance from every subculture simultaneously. By 1926, Business leaders could praise Cass as a monumental achievement of education and architecture, of which any city would be proud. This included those art programs that are in high school music, and Cass Tech's own literature says that they placed students in enviable positions in symphony orchestras, concert bands, radio, and dance bands. So this is teens, 20s, 30s. As those positions dried up in the post-war period, the emphasis shifted to preparing students to be music teachers, creating a very constructive cycle of educational continuity that I've been looking at. Cass Tech's alums readily and universally praised the school's music training. They, quote, are affectionate and loyal to Detroit. Now, one doesn't think Detroit's a place people are affectionate and loyal about. It's supposed to be this gritty city we barely escape from. But when you look into the music, you get a different storyline. Okay? Alongside African-American students, the white students at Cass Tech were on a jazz track. They were recruited straight out of the classroom in the early 40s to the Tommy Dorsey and Stan Kenton bands. Some of these kids were Polish Americans, and some went out to fuel the engine of polka that energized their huge population, which I'll get to. There's a great history of all this by a woman named Lori Gomulka, whose father was a big-time polka musician. She quotes this one band leader, Stan Wisniak, about Cass Tech. "When I heard that concert band, tears just rolled down my eyes. Boy, I'm going to be a part of this. It just warmed my heart." Apparently, the students would skip school to hear Tommy Dorsey at the nearby Fox Theater. The music teachers would also turn up and take attendance and stay. So this is serious music training. And then, some of these kids will get hired. They could move out to New York, or people could move back to their home neighborhoods out of this. They were both kind of viable career options that Cass Tech made available. African Americans really benefited from this rigorous yet open-minded curriculum. Ronald Carter, I have him on the programs, trained in classical chamber music. I know people who played string quartets with him on the cello at Cass Tech. And this carried on through the work of Marcus Belgrave, who was brought late in the game and who taught Jerry Allen. Jerry Allen's most recent album, Grand River Crossing, is about crossing this huge street in Detroit that I knew very well. She says, in her album, "At Cass Tech, we didn't just have a few music classes, we had 3 years of intensive training by master teachers and Detroit artists in residence for the fields of the classics, old and modern, jazz, spirituals, and the blues." So note the blending of the kind of superculture and subcultural musics within this. Regina Carter is another Belgrave student. She combines her subcultural heritage and school training on her recent album, Southern Comfort, which is really interesting. She has pieces that are written around memories of her childhood trips back to Alabama from Detroit on family visits, and she uses 30s field recordings from nearby to where we are sitting in the recording. So she's combining her Cass Tech technical classical training with the sounds of the cotton field in this kind of very interesting way, which is a very Detroit story. For other types of subcultural students who you had to qualify to get to Cass Tech, the white Southerners, the Jews, Italians, Armenians, Greeks, Serbs, etc., 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 the grounding in theory and the ensembles became a gateway to different careers. One of my orchestra mates was the clarinetist Hachi Kazarian, who is an absolute icon of Armenian-American music for 50 years. He said he learned more about mainstream music at Cass than he did at Juilliard, which he dropped out of. He got on this track by going directly from school to a jobs at ethnic bars. Another guy in the orchestra before my time, Rodney Glusak, said he started a Serbian band with 2 classmates in 1951, and they broke up in 2009. Okay. So music survives dislocation and suburbanization when a subculture knows what it wants from its school-trained musicians. And these are part of the story I'm telling. Education moved these kids off the path to the assembly line, though some of them still had to log time at factories to get by if the music work dried up. And various people have told me that. One said, Cass saved me from the Detroit industrial ghetto. My standmate, Darwin Apple, an African-American violinist, was the only one in the orchestra and the first one in some major orchestras in America, and he was glad to leave an industrial future for a position in a major symphony orchestra. Most of these kids were immigrants from Europe or the American South. the renowned violinist sisters Ida and Ani Kavafian, standbys of Lincoln Center music, were born in Istanbul. My successful buddies, Daryl and Robert Barnes, actually came from Kentucky. And against the hillbilly stereotype that you might have, their mother, who was from Lexington, was a professional French horn player who was in the Detroit Symphony, which she had to quit because she couldn't be a mom and a professional in those days. And both those boys ended up in the Philadelphia Orchestra and the Boston Symphony, coming from Kentucky. Okay. So this nexus, this convergence that happens, say, in classical music is something that really, really interests me. My friend Rita Sloan, that I knew very well, came as a refugee after the war from displaced person camps to Detroit. Her family decided they had to have a piano and gave it its own room in their house, so she had to double up with her sister. So this is a kind of value systems that came with families that I'm also very interested in. Okay, so now that brings me to part 3, more on the actual internal subcultural space of these communities. So there are 3 books that actually helped me on it. There's no literature on the city of Detroit to read. I mean, anything about the city of Detroit, sociology, urban history, there's like fewer than this many books that are worth reading about the city of Detroit. It's such a major place. It's just unbelievable. And on music, fortunately, recent years, 3 books came out. One is called Before Motown, which is the history of jazz in Detroit, before Motown, which is very, very helpful. There's Laurie's book on Polish-American music, and one called Detroit Country Music on the white Southern community. So this makes it possible for me to do a little work that I'll lay out for you and make some maps. I had some GIS maps made by students, this is just on, they're not like statistically viable, but these books are done by enthusiasts who tell you what club everybody played in, where the addresses were. I love books like this, and then you can actually use them to construct some kind of geographic spatial sense. So I'll give you a little bit of this. This is a map that combines Polish versus country music, and you can see that the country music is more the star-shaped things. The Polish music is more concentrated. The country music is all over the city because there was this huge scattered population where somebody like the Poles were basically in their enclave of this city within a city called Hamtramck, but they overlap into downtown spaces, which are the clubs, the radio studios, the recording studios. So you can see that in this kind of just spread of those maps, to the extent you can map this properly. Here's another one that I was able to get out of this book, Country Music. Where were these guys born and where did they play? And you can see they're all born in the absolute heartland of what would be country music, with a few exceptions, mostly Kentucky, Tennessee, West Virginia. And then you can see where they traveled. And just like in Detroit, these people are traveling all over the country. As are the Serb musicians and the Polish musicians, because there's networks. So every group has its network. Of course, the white Southern music network is probably more vast than some of these ethnic networks, which wouldn't have as many different spots on the circuits, right? So I'm only going to play a little tiny bit of music in this talk because I'm doing so many other things. But I'll give you 2 subcultural examples that are very, very indicative. The first is from the African American music community, which was centered for an entire generation on Hastings Street. And actually, my father lived on Hastings Street when he was a small child before this wave of the Great Migration. There was a Jewish neighborhood there. So I know about Hastings Street. There is a song by a guy named Detroit Count. His real name was Robert White, came from Chattanooga, and he did a song called Hastings Street Opera. And I have to credit Dick Spotswood for finding me this, of course. And Hastings Street Opera is this piece where he lists every bar. It's 2 sides of a 78, and he runs out before he... Yusuf Lateef said, not even Detroit Count could have covered all the places there were. That's how many joints there were. So I'll give you a little flavor of that. It's hard to understand him, of course. But let's see. Okay, I'll get to this. Oops. No. Go back. All right. Here we go.
Hastings Street Opera. Boys all down Hastings Street. swallow beer, you turn your head and somebody else is trying to drink it up. Well, that's a bad joint. Well, down the line, down Hastings Street. Palmer, Harry, Kirby, Frederick, Golden Bell across the street. That's the only place you walk in, you have to shovel the sawdust off the floor before you can buy yourself a drink. Hastings Street Opera. Well down Hastings Street. Broadway and Hastings.
This is on YouTube, so I urge you to listen to the rest of it. That's an amazing piece of music, and it's deep Detroit. Okay. The second little example, it comes from the Southern White World. This is 1939, but it talks on inter-subcultural relations, which in Detroit, would lead to riots. But the so-called hillbillies, these white Southerners, did not get along with the older Catholic European populations. The Poles and these Appalachian people did not get along at all. The most famous country group that lived in and out of Detroit was the York Brothers, and they came out with a song called Hamtramck Mama. Now, I showed you Hamtramck on the map as this, fortress of Polish culture. So here's the York Brothers referencing of Hamtramck. No. Why is this thing so twitchy? Oh, right. You're going to play this, right? Oh, I turned down the sound.
Talk about your cooking, mama, boys, I've got one. She's a Hamtramck baby and she has her fun. She's a Hamtramck mama, and she sure does know her stuff. She's the hottest thing in town. Oh, Lordy, how she can love. Oh, she cooks them in the daytime, shimming at night. She's a Hamtramck mama and she shakes it right. She's a Hamtramck mama, and she sure does know her stuff. She's the hottest thing in town.
The mayor of Hamtramck tried to get it banned from airplay. It was not a happy situation. So this gives you some sense of the subcultural activity, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my own subcultural space. My group positioned itself on the frontier, the border between superculture and subculture very deliberately. The Jews turned inward musically in their own practices, and I'll talk about that, but they also pushed resolutely outward into the mainstream as a part of a generalized policy. The Jews encapsulate the anxieties and achievements in minority agency in ways that differ from these other activities of all these other groups I've been mentioning. The community mushroomed in the 1910s, jumping in a few years from 10,000 to 50,000, including my grandfather and great uncles, and peaked at around 90,000. So it's a pretty large minority within Detroit. They were all in a single neighborhood, and they were deeply divided on all kinds of lines. One scholar says, different voices seem to cry out in disharmony for resolutions to a confusing mixture of problems and questions about the Jewish community. And I think anybody who knows the Jewish community, this is pretty much right. So I can talk about two little trends. One is the extroverted tendency to push outward in classical music cosmopolitanism and the kind of interior religious practice. The newly emancipated Jews of Europe, starting around 1800, used European classical music as a way to join the mainstream in ways that are strategic but also deeply felt. You think of Mendelssohn and Mahler, but also all the orchestra members and the audience that supported classical music in Berlin and Vienna, Odessa, Kiev, Warsaw, every city. And there is no book on this, which is amazing. There's no book about that. I started violin lessons at the age of 4, right? And I'd already been to, I asked, I want to play the violin because I already had seen Jascha Heifetz and Misha Elman at this age. Here I am on my way to my first lesson. Let's see, here's my first concert. This is in high school. Then at Cass Tech, right? Right, yeah, okay, now we go back. And that is the interior world. Okay, my parents' social circle gathered at the orchestra concerts, and the Jewish community kept the Detroit Symphony Orchestra alive when the flickering interest of the city's auto moguls endangered the organization. They came to this late. It's Detroit. It's not Chicago and Cleveland. There was no orchestra hall. That's another story. If I had time, I would tell you, which is very amusing. And they get this, but they like pull their money out of it. So the Jews wanted it to happen. A couple of people, including two of my violin teachers, organized a chamber orchestra called the Little Symphony that kept things running. They gave concerts at an upscale Jewish restaurant when there was no Detroit Symphony. At another time, a guy called Sam's Cut Rate kept sponsorship of the symphony going. Community ladies had organized the Music Study Club in the 1920s, which paralleled the non-Jewish Tuesday Musicale that went back to the 1880s. And I was in that crowd. We played at Music Study Club gatherings, and they gave scholarships for child prodigies who went off to have big careers. One of the interesting moments was the decision to hire a Jewish composer from Vienna named Julius Chayas, who was charged with, in 1940, to organize a professional level orchestra and a music school at the Jewish Community Center, which was very linked to the Detroit Symphony Orchestra. So there's this parallel establishment and integration of the Jewish community with the mainstream community at this level. He's also bringing in, he had lived in Palestine, so he's bringing in Palestine sound and Zionist things in his own compositions. He gets the Detroit Symphony Orchestra to do a Jewish Music Week. Very complicated. They're playing in black churches. There's a lot of outreach. He couldn't control everything. As I was looking through the newspaper, the Detroit Jewish News, in 1942, Chayas is giving a concert with a black church, and on the same page, it's announced that the Jewish Center Cub Pack will be putting on a minstrel show. So it's a rather complicated set of relationships, say, in 1942. So this epitomizes the dynamism and the complexity of American Jewish musical life that looked both outward and inward. In a turbulent century, it saw the restriction of immigration, the Holocaust, establishment of a state of Israel. But Detroit was the most anti-Semitic city in America. Henry Ford funded vicious propaganda and the publication of the Protocol of the Elders of Zion. The radio priest Father Coughlin was inveighing against the Jews every week to millions across America. There was a plot by the Michigan Black Legion to murder 1 million Jews by planting bombs in every synagogue across America on Yom Kippur. So I'm wondering what my parents were living through in this city in their cultural life. But they also kept their traditional channels of music, and that was that photo. Here I am. My father's teaching me how to do my bar mitzvah chanting. I had a really interesting experience of a grad student named Garrett Field, who was a specialist in South Asian music, and he said, I want to do a paper on, I said, He said, I want to talk about this synagogue boys choir I was in. I said, I had no idea he was even Jewish. I said, where was that? He said, Detroit. I said, what synagogue? He said, B'nai Moshe, which is where I was bar mitzvah. And I said, sure, right? So he and his brother were deeply affected by the cantor there, named Cantor Lewis Klein. One of my projects was the history of the American cantorate that I did. And Lewis Klein actually was a contributor to that project, so I knew who he was. He was another immigrant. He grew up in Romania. He came by Belgium and London. And in Detroit, he sang on radio and TV. He concerted at Catholic retreats. He was another one of these immigrants like Chayas who used musicality, but he's using it in the system of ancient Hebrew sacred music. So I'll read you two little quotes from the Field brothers about the experience of being in the choir. As a young boy raised in a conservative Jewish family, I could sense the high holidays just around the corner. The air became cooler and the leaves began to color. Soon I would be on the bima, the platform of the synagogue, with my boys' choir cohorts circled around the shulchan, the table on which the Torah scroll sits, accompanied by the Hazan, Lewis Klein. The other one says, I remember the excitement and nervousness before heading on stage when we sat with our families, like secretive spies with alternate identities. 1 second, the humble and anonymous son of the Field family, and a minute later, Zam, a regular mini cantor, belting out sonorous renditions of traditional Jewish songs for the audience of fellow congregants. We had done something great and exciting and memorable. It was like a secret, proud friendship and comradeship. So this is a really wonderful statement about internal subcultural life at the same time that they're doing as much outreach as they can. So I'm going to close here with poet 4 here, some little reflections on the notion of urban spatiality and music, and the relationships of all these, because I'm mapping out this vast area, and I'm trying to find some kinds of ways of doing that. Before the internet then, a large urban area like Detroit was a fairly bounded system, even if it was plugged into like national and international circuits of family and marketing. And Lefebvre talks about the imagined space, which is the imagined idea of the city, the design space and the lived space, and this plurality, coexistence, and simultaneity. Music operates among all these worlds. It flows into all kinds of channels. So I'm just going to give you 2 little moments that suggest what I find the interesting issues around some of this. I'm using Yusuf Lateef, who's one of the most influential musical Detroiters. In the mid-50s, Lateef was drawn to Islam at a time when he was also trying to expand the instruments he could play. He was tired of the standard jazz instruments. He picked up the rabat, the North African fiddle. So you would say, well, he went into Islam, he found this North African fiddle because of Islamic connections, and he was, but no, it was an Arab-American co-worker on the line at the Chrysler factory, okay? Now, this is a real Detroit story then, speaking of the camaraderie of the polyglot workforce of the auto industry. For Lateef, the rabat was different from what I'm calling inherently available resources he had. This is what you grow up with and what you have available, what you have in the family and what you get in school. These are things that are inherently available to you. But then there are other things which I'm calling adjacent resources. The factory allowed for the nearness of a music that might have been the third category, inaccessible resources. So there are adjacent resources, inherent ones, adjacent ones that are around there that you might run into and use, and ones that, for whatever reason, are simply not accessible to you at all, physically or conceptually. This reminds me, his experience reminds me of a passage in a poem by Philip Levine, who was the great American poet from Detroit, and I'm using poetry and literature and other things to try to flesh this out. He happened to have to work on the assembly line a little bit, and he writes about my friend Marion, the ex-junkie and novice drop forge worker, off by himself, humming body and soul. He played with Hawkins before his troubles, and now has 4 10-inch bluebirds left to prove it. Hawkins here is Coleman Hawkins, a major figure, and the bluebirds are these records that you've got over here. That's a famous jazz record label. So the adjacency of the workplace gives Philip Levine access to a friend of his who used to play with Coleman Hawkins. So it's something like that Lateef story. The second one is about me and Lateef in a funny way. At the end of the 50s, I used to clutch my violin case at 6:45 a.m. on a cold corner to catch the Dexter bus down to Cass Tech to get there for orchestra rehearsal. After White Flight, I was living in a neighborhood that by then had only 7% of Detroit's Jews, and everybody else was African American. And I would see this club with a glass front. You looked in. It was called the Minor Key. And there would be hand-lettered signs in the window saying, Yusuf Lateef, John Coltrane or whatever. And in fact, I've checked, yes, Lateef played the minor key then exactly when I would have been standing there. So this was adjacent physically to me, but the minor key was not available to me conceptually because I had all this inherently available music, starting with Russian songs, Gilbert and Sullivan, many things that I had in classical music which were physically extremely far away, but conceptually inherent and close to me. But here was this thing that was physically close, which was conceptually distant. It never occurred to me to step inside to hear the music, so I missed all of the golden age of jazz. And I know other kids, I've mentioned this to kids that went to school with me, and they said, oh, we used to be in the minor key all the time, because Kenny, the son of the manager, was this kid in our high school, this Jewish kid, and, we used to go with the minor key, really? There was this other guy I talked to. He said he and his buddy used to walk into bluegrass clubs because they were tired of what they learned from like Pete Seeger from guitar and banjo, and they wanted to hear the real people, how they played those instruments. And I would never do this. This is a more aggressive notion of adjacency than I somehow could muster up. And finally, kids introduced me to jazz, but I couldn't understand why on the wall of Cass Tech it said "Bird Lives." I had no idea what this meant. Charlie Parker had just died then, and you know, I say, "What's that?" You know, okay. But I began to get into jazz. Right? But if you look back farther, it turns out that Cabrera, the great teacher of Latif, and I actually shared a program. So here's my mother's thing, Mark's first concert. No, not that's where I am, going to my first concert. You can see I'm nervous, right? Let's see, here's the program. Mark's first concert. You'll see that I'm in the All City Junior Orchestra, but you'll also see that there's something conducted and arranged by Luis Cabrera on the same program. So I actually kind of shared this space, which was then not a conceptual space, it was a physical space. Okay? And then one more anecdote of this, and then I'll wrap up. At an early convention of the Society for Ethnomusicology, I met a young African-American ethnomusicologist named Sylvia Kinney. Turned out she was a Detroiter. She lived 2 blocks away from me, and she loved the music in Detroit and talked about the great Emancipation Day concerts, which I had never heard of, and I never would have gone to. That is what I would call then an inaccessible resource to me, even though for her it was something really important that happened every year. Okay, so, and of course many African Americans had many experiences with inaccessibility because of conditions of American life, including in the musical realm. So that's part of this complexity. So cities offer conceptual spaces and concrete sites, but not neutrally. It's not just the design city of the street grid. In Detroit, all the players, individuals, groups, the establishment, created and pushed the limits of availability, physically and imaginatively. Music could be heard or unheard, mandated or withheld, like the instruments from Miller, according to largely unwritten rules of improvisation. Collaboration and separation coexisted in a constantly shifting landscape within a community, between neighborhoods and citywide. And Detroit is, of course, famous for its mobility, created and promoted by a capitalist drive that people had to work with or work around. Many of these forms are still around in Greater Detroit, at least 20 miles from where they started, but older ethnic genres have declined, if you can't hear musicians except at festivals or shared venues, you can't exchange things the way you could in the 1940s, when my friend, the great American composer Gordon Muma, who grew up around, he used to take the bus downtown from his white high school in the suburbs to listen to the music in the city. Nobody does that in Detroit today. Okay, mass transit allowed for adjacency, and there was less fear. I'm not saying it was a better musical model, because I almost didn't start this project because I'm fighting nostalgia, and I didn't want to get into that. But I'm trying to show the richness of exploring the inner musical workings of a American city not yet exploded by white flight and the triumph of the freeway, the last phase of the dominance of the Northeast, of an almost desperate style of social and industrial engineering and intense close-up interaction of an older collection of American subcultures with modernity. It's a good site for spatiality studies because it's so tight. It's 1910, and by 1970 it's over, when Detroit was a byword for power, not ruin, and for their manic musical momentum that we all know because we all hear Motown songs like every day. So we were the first to see the new model cars and hear the just released future hit songs. It seems I was lucky to grow up there, and I'm looking forward to continuing this research. Thanks. So if you've got any questions about all this.
Hello, Professor. Thank you again my name is John. I introduced myself before you met.
Yeah.
Thank you for an illuminating, interesting, and poignant talk, in my opinion. I'll just try to keep my comments short, 2 minutes at the most. I'm a lifelong Washingtonian. It's actually a lot of what you said had to resonate with me in the sense that it's kind of, for lack of a better phrase, crossover and mixture and mix and stuff.
Yeah, it's very American. Yeah.
Yes. As someone who's 47 now, I remember, like the friend you described towards the end who took the bus downtown. I heard that often myself, just in terms of, like, I grew up in Rousseau City, Scone Park, Maryland, so I would take the subway or a bike down to the mall and so forth. And my parents are like yours, immigrants, from Colombia. But I knew I was very conscious of my immigrant status, but it wasn't something that I took upon as a burden per se.
Oh.
I almost reveled in it because in some ways it gave me kind of a bit of an outside, not outsider, but more of like an objective opinion about the past history, but also a willingness to explore without even listening field
Yeah.
down by certain things. And that vein regarding your talk, here in DC itself, something explorers should come back as part of the idea of like go-go music, for example. Something very specific to for DC that would not be quite necessarily known about or exposed to a lot of people who would not necessarily know about it. One could argue why that is. Maybe
Right, so these things that are not known or not available, and other things that just,
maybe I'm just simply racial. I'll try to wrap up in a comment, but sometimes it's just simply like I joke about how Robert De Niro once said, "If you don't know, if you go, you'll know. If you don't go, you don't know. If you don't know, you don't know." I mean, literally, if you go somewhere, you'll find out. If you don't go, well, you stay home and read about it. But you know, and I'll stop there. I just want to say brevity. I'll stop there.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's interesting. Every city has its history, and we just don't have these histories, you know.
I'm from Detroit myself.
Oh, well.
And I remember going down to Baker's Keyboard Lounge.
Right,
in the 70s,
right, the great.
Down to Cass Quarter, all those bars down there.
Yeah.
And I also lived in Hamtown for several years.
Okay. Right. Well, it was this amazing musical city.
Can you talk a little bit about radio, and did
Yeah.
radio have impact, or how did? because
There actually is a book. There's the only other book there is called Rockin' Down the Dial, and it's one of these enthusiast histories of radio in Detroit. So I actually know something about that. Because otherwise, how do you find these histories in America? Nobody keeps archives of radios and what happens on the radio, you know. And everybody throws out the tapes and the recordings, and you know. So this guy actually did this. He went through all these stations and what they did, and when they restricted having an R&B and wouldn't possibly have it on, and when they realized there was a big market for this among kinds of black youth, and that it's like, yeah, we ought to be putting this on. And then there's this amazing African-American woman disc jockey who was influential, and but one of the
Martha Jean the Queen.
Exactly, Martha Jean the Queen, right. So it's one of the themes I get from everybody talking about Detroit, and it may be true of other cities, but Detroit is particularly stressed, and it's apparent when you look at Motown, is that it was a city of open ears. It was a city where everybody listened to lots of stuff. And these DJs, there was a DJ Electrifying Mojo, and he would play like Kraftwerk or things like this that African-American teenagers would listen to because there was that station. You know, in German industrial rock or things. And there was the idea that, yeah, we listened, we knew, we heard stuff from all over. Even if you couldn't go to those clubs or you couldn't play in those places or whatever, you heard it all. And radio offered that. There was ethnic radio, although a lot of it got cut when they realized there was more money in rock and roll. They really cut a lot of ethnic radio, but it survived in some ways. As it did in every city. I mean, partly it's the story of every city, but you know, more intense here because when you get like Motown, right? and this you know, immense kind of energy of creating an industry, the first ever African American, you know, music industry, so to speak, of, you know, that was local, where they drew everybody in. So these violin teachers of mine, they were the Motown string section. And those are stories that are really interesting. And they took jazz, they took classical, they took everybody, you know, into the system that they created, which paralleled as an industrial system, was paralleling the auto industry very directly. That's a real Detroit story, and that part of it appeals to me.
So there's another thing that interests me about I grew up in Birmingham when you were...
Yeah,
And you
right.
take the Greyhound bus downtown and just watch a couple of movies and watch Louis Armstrong on stage.
Well, there you go. You're another one of those,
Got
right?
older,
Yeah.
went to a lot of the clubs, Trent,
Uh-huh.
the Flame.
Great.
a whole bunch,
Yeah.
The Drome.
These were the major, right?
But, you know, one thing that happened, it seems to me, that I was told by black friends was in '67, it was the dividing line of
Yeah.
being able to go to clubs or not.
Yeah. Yeah.
And black friends of my general economic background, they said for them it was not welcoming to go to the clubs that we always used to go to as a shared experience.
Oh, okay.
But the riots,
But they weren't welcome in the white clubs?
they weren't welcome, they didn't feel welcome in the black clubs.
In the black clubs? Oh, the white people didn't feel welcome.
No, I'm talking about black,
Okay.
middle class.
Oh, all right.
high-earning blacks.
I see. Yeah.
Felt that they weren't welcome as much in the black clubs.
Okay.
I thought that was a watershed of some.
Yeah.
It's been back in a while.
Well, there still are some clubs, but you know, I mean, the whole thing was gutted. I mean, Hastings Street was literally paved over to create the Chrysler Freeway. So they destroyed the entire culture of this population and their music community. They literally did that. So you know that offers you fewer choices, right? Yeah.
As a native Kentuckian, I was kind of taken aback when you said there was actually a French horn player.
No, because of the
And I thought,
right, because of the stereotypes. Yeah.
that Kentucky is all hillbilly.
Right.
Might as well say
Right.
Michigan is all industrial ghetto.
Yeah, no, that's why I use the example, because it goes against these stereotypes that people have about who these people were and what they might have been listening to. No, I mean, that's exactly why I brought that example.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the ethnic music, like the polka?
Yeah, I mean, wow, it's fascinating. This whole world. There are different stories to tell, you know, depending on which group it is, and how musically active they were for their size and scale. I mean, I've been trying to figure that out. So I have some stories of some of the communities, and I know some of them interact with each other. Others really kept themselves. The Poles were so massive, this 350,000 people population in this city, that they didn't need, you know, they were really self-sufficient in a way. So it's a lot of people played with Poles in there, but they didn't have to kind of go out that much in certain kinds of ways. But they benefited from the school systems, yeah, and some of them went off on this jazz track. Whereas smaller groups, the Serbs and the Croats and the Romanians would play together and share repertoires, but then, you know, later when you got the Yugoslavia war, that stopped. You know, so these diasporic lives connect to homelands and what's going on in other places in certain ways. There were gypsy Roma musicians who moved around from one thing to another. It's complicated, and it's just really badly researched. There's just very little that I've been able to, you know, bring into this to really do a thorough job, which would because nobody kept records of these people. So you can talk to some of them, and there's some things to read, but I mean some interviews and things like that. But there's not anywhere the kind of data you'd want to have a really serious mapping of what all those people were up to in those communities.
One quick comment, 30 seconds. If you're here in DC for a little bit, even this afternoon, if I may suggest one resource outside, not living against the Library of Congress, but a very excellent used bookstore a few blocks away.
Uh-huh.
There's a lot of great used books on things that are, looks like very eclectic, and for example, art. But quick example, in the basement of the bookstore, the Capitol Book used bookstore, so one was a section on journalism, for example. So you want to find memoirs, whatever, different journalists all around. And there's also a music section too, but you'll see books all over the place. If you have a visit, please take a look at it. You might come across something that could be useful in your future research.
Thanks, sure. It's always good to find books.
My best used bookstore in the city, in my opinion.
Speaking of books,
Yeah.
another question. I know you brought some books.
Well, you asked me to come up with a book. I thought the smallest, cheapest one that goes with the Folk Life Center would be the one to bring.
Introduction to Folk Music, which is a great book. I wanted to thank Mark Slobin for coming today and giving a great talk. And please join me in thanking.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.